I'm Tim Bowman, as Stacy mentioned, and I investigate features of scholarly communication, social media use, and altmetrics. I've been studying aspects of scholarly communication and altmetrics for the past 6 years. And today I want to talk about the meanings of altmetrics, and I'm going to go discuss this from a theoretical perspective. So let's get started. So if we look back at the research of the late 90s and the 2000s, we find that Blaise Cronin and others were beginning to discuss the impact the web and electronic publishing would have on scholarly communication and bibliometrics. In several seminal pieces, Cronin and others predicted the changes we would find today when examining scholarly communication and altmetrics. Cronin noted that in 1998, that web-based scholarly communication will be driven by polymorphous mentioning, which basically means mentioning in many forms. He went on to define this many form mentioning as invocations, and this is an interesting definition to use, or term. It means the act of calling upon or referring to something as a concept or document for support and justification in a particular circumstance. This is, interesting, especially as we consider that Cronin used it before it captured an act that was something other than acknowledgements or citations, and better describe the various kinds of acts the web affords. In a later work from 2005, Cronin noted there would be a critical mass of digital objects and usage statistics, which could be used to track the scholarly influence and impact of scholars. I hope this sounds familiar, of course, because it's quite accurately describing our current situation. Note that Cronin's articles were published just as social media, as we know it today, was beginning. As a reminder, Blogger was founded in 1999, Friendster launched in 2002, LinkedIn and MySpace came about in 2003, and Facebook just started interesting Harvard students in 2004, and Twitter followed in 2006. So if we move on to the next slide, we look at the Altmetrics Manifesto, which came about 5 years after Cronin's 2005 article. And it was written and published by Priam, Taraborelli, Groth, and Nayland. Priam, one of the authors of this manifesto, first came up with the term altmetrics, aptly enough, in a discussion on Twitter. The manifesto was published in the fall of 2010, and it called for researchers to examine online platforms and tools in order to assist with the filtering and the vastly growing number of academic documents being published. And it basically states that we want to determine if these altmetrics reflect impact or just empty buzz. The important thing to note about this manifesto is that it called for altmetrics to be considered firstly as filters for scholars. The notion of altmetrics as indicators of impact was something of a secondary consideration. The manifesto helped create a real interest in this area of study. And attracted scholars from many different disciplines, including bibliometrics, library and information science, sociology, psychology, economics, and physics, to just name a few. Today, altmetrics research has been published in a number of different journals across many fields. A recent study by Sugimoto, Wer, Costin, and Lariviere identified 300 plus articles focusing on altmetrics research. A quick search about the topic in the Web of Science listed over 400 research documents. We are in an exciting period of interest in altmetrics. We are tracking many different types of altmetric acts, yet we are still just scratching the surface. So if we move to the next slide. Of course, it is very important for us to have a definition of altmetrics, especially as scholars. On the screen, you'll find 4 definitions of altmetrics, with many more available. In fact, it seems that most of the articles being published still attempt to define altmetrics in slightly different ways. And this term itself, altmetrics, is still contested in the research. The first definition on the top left is from the NISO group effort that had contribution from many scholars in the field and was first published in 2016. They define altmetrics as the broad term that encapsulates the collection of multiple digital indicators related to scholarly work. These indicators are derived from activity and engagement among diverse stakeholders and scholarly outputs in the research ecosystem, including the public sphere. If we move clockwise, we find a definition from Ady and Rowe. Note that this is from 2013 and is very general. It states that the Altmetrics is the creation and study of new metrics based on the social web for analyzing and informing scholarship. If we continue clockwise, we see a definition from Priam, who, as we mentioned earlier, came up with the Altmetric Manifesto and the term itself. And this was from 2014, so 4 years after the Manifesto. And it said that Altmetrics is the study and use of scholarly impact measures based on activity and online tools and environments. And finally, we have a definition from my colleagues and I, where we say that Altmetrics are events on social and mainstream media platforms related to scholarly content or scholars, which can be easily harvested through APIs and are not the same as more traditional concepts of citations. So you can see there's this differences in the definition itself of Altmetrics, which makes researching it very interesting because we all have kind of different idea of what metrics is all about. Some people want to call it social media metrics or just social metrics. We've landed on the term Altmetrics, and that's fine. It allows us to put an umbrella over the research that's being done and allows us to think about Altmetrics in a specific way. But it is important that we think about how we define the term itself. And I would imagine as we move forward, this NISO definition is going to be used more and more as it's one of the most recent definitions of Altmetrics, and it comes from a group of scholars that have come together in agreement to publish this definition. So if we move to the next slide. So we have this idea that Altmetrics is difficult to define, and my colleagues and I came up with a framework for us to understand Altmetric X. And we wanted to do this because, again, Altmetrics are better, the platforms themselves where we're capturing these events are very, very heterogeneous, so they're very different. And we wanted to come up with an overall framework where we could apply these ideas of access, appraise, and apply to Altmetric events in a way that allows us to apply this framework across multiple platforms. So we developed this framework, and on the screen you'll find this graphical representation in which we categorize these captured Altmetric events as 3 different types of acts. So as you see in the center, we have this spiral, and each of the spirals, the colors are acts. And the 3 acts we came up with are access, appraise, and an apply. And as you move clockwise around the spiral, the level of engagement with the research object itself increases. So the reason we started with, at the top, the research object is because we wanted to define it in the most general terms. So a research object can both be a document or an agent themselves. The document can be, in the broadest terms, many things. So it can be an article, a book, a video presentation, data. So we have these research documents that we can then see mentions of in these various social media platforms. But this also goes for agents. So we have the scholar themselves, we have universities, we have organizations. So we have agents as research objects that, again, can be accessed, appraised, and applied in online platforms. So we wanted to come up with this Altmetric framework so that we could better understand levels of engagement one has with the research object, which can help us choose an appropriate methodology or theory to apply to our results. Next slide. And when we look at applying theories to acts, we see that we can apply citation theories, which are more traditional in the bibliometrics and library and information science fields, or we can apply other theories such as social, psychological, economical, etc. And in the early stages of Altmetric research, many scholars applied bibliometric methods and citation theories to the understanding of Altmetric events. Various efforts were made to see if there were correlations between citations and Altmetric events. For example, do highly tweeted articles receive more citations than articles that weren't found on Twitter? To date, a small correlation has been found with papers in Mendeley and higher citations, yet other platform acts do not seem to correlate with citations. Now, scholars are beginning to examine other aspects of the research object referenced in Altmetric events, such as document properties, so the title length, abstract length, gender, collaboration component, and open access status. In addition, researchers are beginning to examine the people performing the acts, the networks to which they belong, and the effects of bots in Altmetric accounts. So my co-authors and I, when we developed the Altmetric framework, also called for scholars to apply theories from various fields, including, as I mentioned before, sociology, economics, psychology, computer science, and linguistics, to interpret these Altmetric acts. For example, we need to consider the attention economics of a Mendeley user who has added a research object to their library. What does this mean? Does this save them time in the future and allow them to work more effectively? So they've added a research object to the Mendeley library. Does this affect their attention in the future? Or we can examine how tweeting about a specific object can affect one's impression to others. If I tweet about a paper in Nature, does this affect the impression my colleagues in the public have for me? Because I'm tweeting something that's been published in Nature, which is a high reputation. Another example would be to examine how a blogger applies a research object to their blog post. So how this might affect their social capital when someone reads their blog post. If I cite a well-known article written by someone very high in their field to make a point, does this affect my social capital? So as you can see, we can apply citation theories, and that's fine to these altmetric events, but given that these platforms are social in nature, it's important for us to consider theories that are from sociology, psychology, and other fields when we interpret these altmetric events. Next slide. Two of the key points that we must remember as professionals when examining altmetrics are that the contexts are constantly changing and that the norms of use are constantly in flux. For example, Twitter has recently made a change to allow more characters in the tweets. Now, how will this affect the sharing of these research objects on the application, and how will we compare results across time? Can we compare tweets with 140 characters that mention a research object with tweets that contain more characters mentioning a research object? How can we track the altmetric events from platforms such as ResearchGate and academia.edu when they don't have an API and they are a closed system? Are we missing important events? What about the users in these platforms? We're missing a large population of scholars who are presumably talking about research objects, yet we can't capture these events. What happens when a new platform emerges? So how do we know when to start collecting from a platform? Do we think that this platform will be conducive to scholars sharing research objects or the public sharing research objects? What if they don't have an API or they're unwilling to share with other researchers? Finally, as these platforms change and users employ different ways of interacting within them, how do we identify norms and rules of use? Developers of these platforms may specify certain scenarios, so they may say this is how you use our platform, but we know that users often come up with unexpected ways to use platforms. So how do we then detect these norms and rules of use and interpret that within the framework of altmetric acts? Next slide. So we're talking about the definition of altmetrics. We're talking about the framework for understanding altmetric acts. And we hinted about the academic reward system and how altmetric events may contribute to the academic reward system in the future. And my colleagues and I recently published an article looking at the academic reward system through a Bourdieusian lens. A better way to contextualize altmetrics is to examine its place in the academic reward system itself. So we published this paper and we used concepts and ideas from prominent sociologist Pierre Bourdieu. And Bourdieu often wrote on the power dynamics in society. And in a few of his works, he applied his thoughts and concerns to academia and the machine of science. He wrote in simplistic terms that there are certain games taking place in society, and that these games contain certain rules, and that the players actually cooperate to maintain this game. He called this game the illusio, and stated that by playing the game, one can create symbolic capital. For years, this illusio of the academic reward system was well understood by the players, and the game was afoot, as they say. But we think that is now changing with the advent of altmetrics and the use of social media. Universities, funding organizations, and governments now want the societal impact of the research they are supporting to be determined. So how do we do that? One way that has been proposed is to use altmetrics. And this has created this change, or at least this perception of change within the illusio of the academic reward system, as scholars struggle to determine the new rules and determine how to work together to play the game, as they say. Next slide. Now, this whole idea of the academic reward system as a game was also discussed by Cronin, who we mentioned earlier, who had a lot of great ideas about, of course, the academic reward system and scholarly communication. And Cronin himself used ideas from Bourdieu and others to make a case for a reward system of science. And this reward system of science contained authorship, citations, and acknowledgements. And in Bourdieu terms, we can basically say that this triangle of science, reward triangle of science, which I've indicated as a stool with 3 legs, makes up the rules of the game, the rules of the illusio. Now, Cronin's contribution allows us to identify these pillars that make up the symbolic capital of academics. On the screen, it's represented as the 3-legged stool, as I mentioned. But again, we think this is in the process of change. The change is brought about by the game of academia, in other words, the illusio and the rules and cooperation of the players mentioned by Bourdieu can be identified in the 4-legged stool on the right of the screen. My co-authors and I argue that visibility in social media is now the 4th leg of the stool. These changes have caused a tension in scholarly communication between respecting traditions, understanding current events, and looking toward the future. Next slide. So if we focus on the first leg of the stool, we are, of course, focusing on authorship and inventorship. And as Stacy mentioned in the introduction, Altmetric.com is now collecting patent information. And this is a part of this authorship and inventorship leg of the stool. And authorship is what drives scholarship. We have to publish or perish, to basically borrow a common phrase. And Cronin called authorship the undisputed coin of the realm. Now, scholars have been tracking this activity for a long time, of course, through various means. Yet, we are still trying to figure out how to measure its importance. It's difficult. It's difficult to measure because it's complicated. As Zuckerman noted, it's a multi-tiered form of social capital. In fact, not only do we rely on the authors themselves to determine the list, basically who's first, who's middle, and last, we also rely on various guidelines developed by editorial associations. So certain times there are rules that are applied to how we determine who is an author. Now, in addition to the authorship, we have the inventorship to consider. And patents are difficult to assign value to within science. Yet there's often a clear economic value for the work. And patent research is being undertaken now that we're starting to track these patents, and we'll start learning more and more about this impact that patents have on authorship and the reward system of science. But though the study of tracking of this measuring authorship has been around a long time, there are still many questions about how to effectively value this act both within and outside of academia. Next. Now, the second leg of the stool is citations. Now, as Merton famously noted, citations are the pellets of peer recognition. With citations, we are traditionally acknowledging the work that came before our own work. However, there are many ways citations are utilized. This makes citation tracking difficult to understand and value. One could basically self-cite. One could form a group with others to agree to cite each other. They could break up a work into multiple papers, all in order to increase their citation counts and increase their scientific capital. Now, bibliometricians have come up with several ways to measure citations, yet there is still quite a bit of disagreement among researchers about the interpretation of these measures. We've all heard of the journal impact factor and the H-index, to measure which are used often but highly contested by bibliometricians. The measure of citations and the development of indicators of output and impact have had adverse effects on publication practices. One only has to think about those seeking tenure to understand the impact that these indicators have had on scholars. Yet, the use of these various indicators continues and have become an important rule of this academic game that we're describing. So the elusio, the rules, and the collaboration between the players of the game are impacted by these various indicators. Next. Now, the third leg of the stool is acknowledgements, and a lot of people don't think about acknowledgements, but they can be considered, as Cronin noted in 1995, a simple scholar's courtesy, but they also have an impact on the social capital of those acknowledged. Acknowledgements can reveal important contributions to the research made by researchers who were not considered as authors. They can also highlight intellectual contributions made by others. Think of a passing mention of a theory by a friend that happened to be used in the work, or the help of a colleague to proof a paper, and they provide useful suggestions that allow you to publish that work. Oftentimes, these kinds of contributions are acknowledged without leading to an authorship for that person. Even more so than citation, acknowledgements are difficult to interpret and value, as you can imagine. For some time, acknowledgements were not even tracked by the large databases, but that is changing now. While acknowledgements have been a long part of the academic game, we are now beginning to explore their value, and which may have an effect, again, on the rules of the game and the collusion between the players. Next slide. Now, finally, this fourth leg of the stool that we've introduced is visibility in social media, and that's why you're here today to talk about Altmetrics. And the traces of these acts in social media and online worlds provides us with very useful indicators surrounding research objects. But visibility in social media refers to more than just these acts. It also refers to the way a scholar manages their online presence, their network connections, the social capital that they receive from being online, etc. And what we have learned with our investigations into Altmetrics is that the use of these platforms vary greatly. Use varies across disciplines, by age, by gender, and other demographic factors. And the research is ongoing. We're continuing to learn more. And these demographic characteristics should be taken into consideration when interpreting Altmetric results. Another important aspect of social media is overall use. Previous research has shown that approximately 10% of scholars use Twitter, although this varies depending on what you read and who performed the research. But other tools are used less often. So if we're saying that scholars are using these tools, we need to basically prove it. We need to say that, yes, we have percentages that say that this many scholars are using Twitter or Mendeley or Facebook or Google+, etc. Now, over time, we have seen an increase in the use of these platforms as the academic game, the rules of the game, continue to change. But we're still talking about a small portion of the scholars. Now, that is a quick summary of the four-legged stool of the academic reward system of science, as my colleagues and I discussed it in our article, and I would invite you to read the article for a more in-depth discussion of the changing game of academia. Next slide. Now, one thing important that we've talked about the definition of Altmetrics, the frameworks to view Altmetrics, the changing nature of the platforms, and the varying use of the platforms by scholars. We also need to talk about how the platforms themselves appear to us. So Altmetrics, this is taken from their website, tracks several sources, which are listed on the screen. Now we can we can look at counterclockwise at the 11 o'clock position, starting with blogs, book reviews, F1000, Facebook, etc. So all these platforms, altmetric.com monitors. In addition, they are taking now citation counts from the Web of Science and Scopus. But it's important to note, and this is found on their help site, their support site, when they started collecting this information. So on the right of the screen, you see that Twitter began in October 2011, and then down the list. So as we compare Altmetric results, we need to consider the heterogeneity of these platforms and when altmetric.com, if you're using this data, actually started collecting the information. So we also need to look at how scholars investigate these platforms. They're looking at it from a research object perspective. So altmetric.com finds, say, a tweet in Twitter based on a DOI mention. Now, we're looking at it then from the mention of a DOI. That means from the perspective of finding that DOI in a tweet. What we need to start doing is also look at it from a user's perspective so that we can identify users within these platforms who are scholars or the public and go from that angle and look at their total amount of tweets, how that tweet referencing a research object fits into their overall catalog of tweets. So let's move on. Another important aspect is that we need to think about the coverage of research in these various platforms. Now, Mendeley is a reference manager, so it makes sense to us to say that 60 to 80% of recent journal articles with DOIs published, say, between 2003 and 2012 in the Web of Science were found in Mendeley. But if we look at the next item in the list, which is Twitter, we see that only 10 to 20% coverage of research with a DOI published between 2005 and 2012 in the Web of Science are found in Twitter, and the platforms drop from there. And this indicates to us that while there are millions, say, of tweets mentioning a research object, many of the tweets are mentioning the same document. So the coverage is narrow and the tweets are many. And there are many differences found between disciplines and journals as well. So we need to think about what the research found in these platforms actually tells us about what kind of research people are sharing in general, such as, is it because it was published in Nature? Is it the type of research object that's being shared? So is it an article, a book, a review, data set, etc.? Is it because it's sociology and users can understand the language of this much more than mathematics? Or was it because the author is a female and we are talking about gender equality and we want to share more research from women in social media? Or is it because, say, the research document was published in an open access journal and it allows others to have access to this easily and share it in the social media platforms? So these are the kinds of things that we're thinking about as we move along in our study of altmetrics. Next. Now, what we need to think about also is actually what's needed. So what is needed from this point forward? First of all, we are missing a huge component, and that is academic social networks. So we don't have data from ResearchGate or academia.edu. And these are two platforms known to be used by scholars. Why don't we have the access to this? Well, they have refused to share this with researchers, and they have no API. So we don't have easy access to this data. What also do we need in altmetric research? Well, we need more qualitative studies. It's been really easy for us to start with just the counts or the correlations. How many people have tweeted this set of articles based on, say, factors including title length, authors, collaboration, etc. What we haven't done is actually surveyed the people who are discussing these research objects in social media platforms. Now, I'm not saying we haven't done it at all, because some scholars have made a move to start qualitative work, surveys, interviews, etc. But we need more of these to understand in better depth why people are utilizing social media to share research online. Now, we also need additional studies of these other altmetric sources. Altmetric.com is doing a fantastic job covering these various sources. But what we aren't seeing in the research are studies based on all of this other data. Why is that? Well, because we look at Twitter. And Twitter, at least from the altmetric.com data that I've received, they have over 40 million tweets with research objects being mentioned. And obviously that's growing all the time. Now, if we compare that to, say, Facebook, which they can only collect public posts, we see a much less inventory of Facebook posts to examine. So scholars have shied away from this, but we need to focus on these other altmetric sources because it will give us a greater understanding of, one, how these platforms differ. 2, how the users differ in their behavior, and hopefully how we can interpret these acts in a better way across various platforms. And 3, we need to understand the whole picture of how the public and the scholars are interacting within these various platforms in the online context. Now, finally, what else is needed? Well, other potential altmetric sources. How do we go about identifying other sources of data where we can find mentions of research objects? And at this point, I haven't really discussed it because I'm sure Stacy and the others will talk about it in more detail, but one way that we identify, or altmetric.com identifies research objects within these platforms, is to look for DOI. So we're looking for specific, say, strings of numbers in a specific format, maybe URL domains. Maybe they can track other instances of research objects in varying ways, but primarily, as far as I understand it, it's through DOIs and URLs. So we need to have these other potential altmetric sources to allow us to then mine their posts or whatever they will be for this information to identify these research objects, which becomes difficult and complex. Next. So we've talked about the altmetric event in the term of the definition of altmetrics. So at first we started being very general, and as we've progressed through the years since 2010, we have come up with the NISO definition to discuss impact measures and leads to people discussing altmetrics as some evaluation of societal impact. But what we need to understand is that there's a great diversity in the acts, the motivations, and the platforms investigated. And so we came up with a framework. We came up with the altmetric framework in terms of accessing, applying, etc., research objects in these platforms so that we can better understand what's happening. And research objects can be either a user or a research document. And this allows us to realize that we can apply various theories to these altmetric events in order to understand the meaning of these acts. And we need to continue to do this. And we also realize that these platforms are a constant change, state of flux. Again, Twitter changing, Facebook changes its privacy policies and its posting policies. We have problems with the spread of misinformation, bot use, etc. So everything is in constant change, from how users use these platforms and how the developers are designing these platforms. So we need to understand that this constant state of change will make it difficult for us to compare altmetric event acts across time. We also need to employ qualitative methods to altmetric research. So we need to survey more, we need to interview more, we need to find out why these people are using these platforms to discuss research objects. And we also, of course, need to recognize the limitations of the data. We don't have the whole picture. Oftentimes, when, say, we look at a tweet mentioning a research object, we don't know where that tweet fell, if it fell by itself in the whole stream of Twitter, or if it was part of a conversation. All we have is that one point that mentions a DOI or a URL, and we're able to capture that, but we don't have the whole picture. So we need to think about that as well. And we need to continue to investigate what we are measuring. So are we measuring some form of societal impact, scientific capital, and or something else? So that's my discussion. I hope that makes sense. I tried to keep it at a high level, more theoretical, and discuss this idea of the academic reward system and the Bourdieusian lens of the Elusio, how the game is changing, and then how visibility and social media, i.e. altmetrics, are changing those rules and the collusion between the players. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bowman, for that talk. I love always hearing you talk about theory. So now we can move into the question and answer section of this presentation. We've got a few minutes, I think, built in terms of wiggle time. So if you do have a question from the audience, you can type it in to the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll go ahead and manage those. So to start us out, while we wait for other questions to come in, I had a question for you, Dr. Bowman. How has your study of kind of social theory influenced your own practices as, you know, a relatively early career researcher who is making a name for himself in this particular field, where kind of like there's a lot of understanding of the importance of using social media to advance your own research topics, but then also to you know, create narratives around the impact of the work that you're doing. So can you speak a bit to how what you study is actually influencing your own practices?
Oh, definitely. That was a great question. And, you know, my dissertation looked at the impression management of scholars in Twitter, and I asked them to look at tweets that they've made and rate them as personal or professional. And I compared that result with actually users of Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which are just the general public, and you can pay them to perform acts in Mechanical Turk. So I asked these people in Mechanical Turk to rate these professors' tweets as personal, professional, and we found that often there was a misunderstanding of when a tweet was supposed to be personal and professional. So that really got me thinking about how I used Twitter myself, and I've tried to change my behavior in the sense that I often only post on Twitter now links about my own research or research that I've found through my filters, the people I follow on Twitter, which I then retweet, or, you know, tweets by you and your organization or others studying scholarly communication and Altmetrics. So Twitter has become kind of my professional platform, and Facebook, because as we all know, it's more closed and we can set our privacy settings, has become the arena in which I, you know, talk to my friends and my colleagues and my family in a more relaxed way. So I would definitely say that my personal impression management takes place on Facebook, whereas my professional impression management takes place on Twitter. And of course, I have an account on these various platforms and try to utilize them, but I mainly use Twitter for professional use and Facebook for personal use at this point.
Excellent, thank you so much. So we'll take one more question. We have a really great question here. You touched upon kind of some of the motivations for various kind of traces that are left online via Altmetrics. Can you speak to how cultural bias might impact the data that's available?
Oh, definitely. In fact, some colleagues and I from CWTS, which is in Leiden, just submitted a article that was accepted as a poster to the STI conference this fall, in which we looked at the timing of tweets to articles, and we had a hypothesis that the cultural rules and norms of the user would impact when they tweeted about an article. Now, we didn't specifically find that, but we did see differences between geographical locations. So say Western European users were much more traditional in the way they tweeted about science. So Monday was high, and Wednesday there was a little bit of a peak, and Friday, you know, we started seeing a little bit of a decline, and then the weekend was declining, and then it went back to Monday. Now, we saw that in the Middle East, we saw that on the weekend there was a little bit of a spike. So we see that there are some geographical or maybe cultural differences in the way that the people tweet about research objects in Twitter. Now, of course, this is just a preliminary investigation, and we're going to look at it in more depth. And it's important to note that there are data limitations. So we only were able to look at tweets that had a geotag, which means the geographic identity of the user was assigned to the tweet. And now oftentimes this is not found, so we also have to think about this and also consider that when a user looks or sets up their Twitter profile, they could say they're from the moon, and we would have to, you know, obviously say that this is probably not true and discount that person from our collection. So we have to look at these things more closely. But if we, you know, take into consideration that we have, say, 40 million tweets to look at, and we can find a high enough proportion of these tweets with geographical identification that we can maybe corroborate through their, say, affiliation assignment in their email address that they've listed in Twitter, or look at their profile on Orchid ID to see if they're listed within that region, then we can have a better understanding of the data we're looking at. So they're definitely, that's just one way we've looked at norms and rules of cultures, excuse me, and there are definitely further studies that will be investigating this in the future.
Awesome. Well, thank you again so much for the keynote. Such an excellent presentation, and always lovely to hear from you and what you're working on. So thank you again for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you, Stacy.
All right, so we are now going to